All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Oleh Kotsyuba, and I'm the Director of Publications at Harvard University's Ukrainian Research Institute. And I'm extremely pleased to welcome you all to our book talk dedicated to a book by Filip Slaveski and Yuri Shapoval entitled Stalin's Liquidation Game: The Unlikely Case of Oleksandr Shums'kyi, His Survival in Soviet Prison, and His Subsequent Arcane Assassination. This book talks about a unique person in the history of Soviet Union, especially during Stalin's repressions. As some of you may know, millions of innocent people were arrested in Stalin's Soviet Union during the 1930s in several waves of mass repression. Many of them, under violent interrogation, were forced to confess to crimes that they did not commit. And rather than saving their lives, as the interrogators had promised, such confessions were actually usually the last step to their execution. Oleksandr Shums'kyi is very different in that regard. He was a Ukrainian Marxist revolutionary, and he did not only refuse to confess to such allegations and to make basically a full kind of confession on record, but he sustained for over a decade a protest against his repression and against the Stalinist attack on his country, Ukraine. He was punished, and today we will talk about that. But still, nevertheless, he survived for quite a long time. Shums'kyi is also known as a quote unquote father of Ukrainianization, a policy that for many of his supervisors or his bosses in the Soviet Union was taken too far. And it's my distinct pleasure to turn the floor over to Filip Slaveski, one of our authors. Unfortunately, Yuri Shapoval was not able to join us today. Filip Slaveski is a historian of the Soviet Empire, primarily of Russia and Ukraine. His work focuses on mass conflict and its aftermath, and specifically on food crisis, mass violence, political control, as well as their contemporary echoes. He is the author of Remaking Ukraine After World War II, The Clash of Local and Central Soviet Power, that came out from Cambridge University Press, and of The Soviet Occupation of Germany, Hunger, Mass Violence, and the Struggle for Peace, 1945-47, also from Cambridge University Press. He is currently a senior lecturer in Russian, Soviet, and East European history at the Australian National University. And I'm just extremely pleased to also have with us Michelle Viise, who is the monographs editor here at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard, and who was closely engaged in editing this book for publication. All right, Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Oleh, Michelle, and the others who've made this possible. I'd like, in this 20 to 25 minutes, to connect some strands of this book to the present, especially to help understand the historical roots of Russia's current war on Ukraine. The major strand is the idea of Mala Rossiya, or Little Russia, to which Oleksandr Shums'kyi was a most visceral opponent. The other is understanding the broader operation of arrests and interrogations in the Soviet period, especially in Ukraine in the 1930s and 40s, and in eastern Ukraine, where I've been researching since 2014, especially in Luhansk. The question for us really is, what does Shums'kyi's story, strangely insightful on the broader operation of the Soviet system by its uniqueness, tell us also about the contemporary mechanisms of Russian control over political dissent in Ukraine today? I came to Shums'kyi by reading his suicide letter to Stalin that he wrote in October 1946. I read this letter in the Russian State Archive in Moscow in 2014, at the same time as Russian-backed forces and Russian forces invaded Ukraine. It seemed to me that Shums'kyi's complaints in October 1946 about the Russification of Ukraine after the Second World War were as pertinent about 1946 as they were about 2014. What really sparked his suicide letter is a long process of a sort of moral deterioration, which we talk about in the work. But it was really Nikita Khrushchev's response to Stalin's toast to the Russian people, which people might know of, after the Second World War, where he toasted to them as the most outstanding of all nations of the Soviet Union in its victory over Nazi Germany. In response to Khrushchev's uh, answer to Stalin, Shums'kyi wrote in his letter, and I quote, "Those people of the Little Russian sort always drone on in a servile, flattering, and pernicious way about our older Russian brother, and about he is always helping his younger brother, the Ukrainian people." Nikita Khrushchev, in the lyrical ecstasy of his Little Russianness, not only sang about the seniority of the Russian people to the Ukrainian and about how the Russians helped their younger Ukrainian brothers, but went so far as to howl on about how the gratitude of the Ukrainians should be delivered to the Russians. Gratitude for what? For the clear mind, strong character, and iron will of the Russians, it turns out. Coming from the head of the Ukrainian government, this is offensive and demeaning to the Ukrainian people. Because what? The Ukrainian people don't have clear minds, strong character, or an iron will? Now I see that I've exhausted all avenues to achieve my political rehabilitation and have accomplished nothing. I am left with only one form of protest against the injustice committed against me: suicide. I take this step not out of fear of deprivations, suffering, further humiliations, and a desire to avoid them. I have survived all of this and can survive no more. I take this step as protest against the new nationalities policy, the policy of great Russian chauvinism against Ukraine. It is against this attempt to transform Ukraine into a amorphous political body, into Little Russia, Mother Russia. It is against this castration of the Ukrainian people that I raise my voice of protest. End quote. One could list the so-called republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, announced in 2014, as perfect examples of these amorphous bodies Shums'kyi described. Shortly thereafter, in 2014, I travelled to Ukraine. I met Yuri Shapoval for the first time. I didn't know Yuri. I'd known that he'd written in the 90s something about Shums'kyi, and I met him by chance at a conference. And as I approached him and said, Yuri, my name's Philip, I'm from Australia, I'd like to talk to you about Oleksandr Shums'kyi, he sort of dropped his book in amazement and said, "Really? Australians are interested in Oleksandr Shums'kyi?" And we spoke for hours then and there and decided that it was really important that we do something about Shums'kyi, not only to bring this important and long ignored figure to light and to look anew at the experience of Ukrainians in Soviet repression in the 1930s and 40s. I mean, our research encouraged some significant revisions here, but it was also to come to terms with past and present in Ukrainian and Russian relations, with Shums'kyi as the major conduit between the 1920s, 30s, and 40s and the current period. And Russia's full-scale military invasion of Ukraine on 24 February 2022 brought this attempt and Shums'kyi all the more into the contemporary. Shums'kyi was Soviet Commissar for Education in Ukraine in the 1920s, one of many who despise the old view as Ukraine as Little Russia, echoed by now the current president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, as with dictators in the Kremlin before him. In this view, Ukraine is not a real country. It is simply invented, a subservient appendage of its great neighbor, Russia, long the center of his so-called Russian world. Armed with this idea, as well as guns, tanks, bombs, missiles, and other murderous instruments of war, Putin brought Ruski Mir, or Russian world, to all of Ukraine in 2022. Shums'kyi was one of the staunchest opponents of attempts to mold Ukraine into this Malorussian image, and as a leading Soviet official, one of the most effective. Like so many of his socialist comrades in other parties, Shums'kyi joined the Bolshevik Party in the Russian Civil War after the revolution, inspired by the party's socialist democratic agendas of national self-determination, much discussed in 1917 and enacted after 25 October. When the party began to waver from this agenda, Shums'kyi criticized it for its great Russian chauvinism and for its willful ignorance of the differences between Russia and Ukraine and other countries of the former Russian Empire. Shums'kyi thought he could correct the Bolshevik Party's chauvinism from within and help to build a real socialist federation of independent and equal nations, true to the ideals of the revolution of 1917. After Bolshevik victory in the Civil War, his project soon came to naught. Many of Russia's Bolshevik leaders, much like Putin today, proclaimed Soviet Russia's liberation of Ukraine, maintaining there was an unbreakable unity and brotherhood between Russians and Ukrainians. The power and much of the cultural elite in Moscow did not hesitate to strip Ukraine of its nascent independence, removing its leaders and reinstating Mother Russia, albeit in a new Soviet empire of the USSR. From the 1930s onward, thousands of Soviet politicians and intellectuals in Ukraine and other republics who remained committed to the national ideal of 1917 were arrested, forced to confess to false crimes of nationalist counter-revolution, among others, under torture, and executed. Shums'kyi differed. He never confessed to the false crimes the Stalinist state levelled at him. He survived in the penal system for over a decade through tortures that paralysed him and the state's murder of his wife to continue this fight until Stalin had him assassinated in 1946. New generations of Ukrainians have continued Shums'kyi's lifelong battle against the attempt to subjugate Ukraine, now waged by Putin. His attempt brings to mind the disconcerting observations of one of 19th century Russia's most radical and daring political philosophers, Pyotr Chadaev. Chadaev was stung by the failure of the Decembrist revolutionaries in Russia in 1825 and disconcerted by Nicolaevian Russia's imperial national conceit, following what he understood as Russia's hollow victories in the Napoleonic Wars, in which he fought. Chadaev challenged the state and its champions who justified Russia's illiberal rule by stressing its unique non-Western origins and futures. Many of Putinism's contemporary champions of the war in Ukraine echo these sentiments, and like their predecessors, cast aspersions on those who admire the West. Indeed, Tsar Nicholas labelled Chadaev a madman and put him under house arrest in the 1830s when Chadaev expressed publicly his admiration for the new set of enlightened pan-European ideas of constitutions and of civil society sweeping across Western Europe. Chadaev's admiration is not unlike contemporary Ukrainians and even Russians who admire elements of the West in imagining a different model of government and society, indeed of how to live. In the midst of his infamy, Chadaev wrote of his own Russian people, I quote, "We may be said to be an exception among peoples. We are one of those nations which do not appear to be an integral part of the human race, but exist only in order to teach some great lesson to the world." End quote. Shums'kyi learnt personally the great lessons of Stalin's dictatorship, which Soviet Russia showed the world in the 20th century. But who could have imagined that Shums'kyi's fate would have resonated so much in the 21st, when Putin's Russia is now teaching humanity another, eerily similar lesson of how not to live, a lesson in xenophobia, the suppression of free thinking, and unjustified cruelty. In bringing Shums'kyi and other victims of Soviet repression who fought for national self-determination of their peoples and were killed for their so-called nationalism into these contemporary and early 19th century contrasts, the last thing we want to do is to idealize them. We understand them in the context of their time. Shums'kyi, for instance, was a lifelong Marxist revolutionary who helped to build Soviet Ukraine by spilling the blood of his enemies and even sometimes of his comrades. He understood the universe of other human beings, indeed the value of other human beings, only through his revolutionary socialist lens. He was victimized, but in no way merely a victim. But it is exactly their immersion in this space that makes them such useful conduits for understanding it. And this is very much the case for Shums'kyi and his idea of Mother Russia and how it helps to explain the war today. The Bolshevik Party officially supported creating an independent Ukraine in a Soviet Federation through a famous policy called Ukrainization, and I'm sure that many people listening to this webinar would have written about this extensively. But party members were the most important opponents of this policy and worked against it covertly. Shums'kyi called this out. These covert operatives had the advantage in intra-party politics in the 1920s. They could attack their party enemies on the left, who opposed Ukrainization as a dangerous nationalist impediment to socialism, and then those on the right, who supported the policy wholeheartedly as a buttress to nationalist counter-revolution. They continued to change the definition and the policy's acceptable middle ground to push their enemies to the extreme. For Shums'kyi, these covert operatives were dominant in the party, but Ukrainian only in name. The communist Ukraine they were building was neither communist nor independently Ukrainian, but servile to Moscow, as he claimed had always been the case in Ukrainian history. This was the essence of Shums'ky's Malorос thesis, his riposte to Malorossia, which he expressed openly in Politburo meetings in the 1920s. The Ukrainian party elder, Grigory Petrovsky, asked him once, in Russian, why Shums'kyi did not love the term Maloros. After all, the Bolsheviks understood this term as referring to Russified Ukrainians, closer to them culturally than the Ukrainian peasantry, and thus a positive base for building Bolshevik rule in Ukraine. Shums'kyi understood the term differently and replied to Petrovsky, who he considered a Maloros, thus, I quote, "Why don't I love this despicable, selfish little Russian? Because he has always been equally unprincipled, hypocritical, slavishly insincere, and treacherously flattering across all historical epochs. Now he calls himself a communist and shouts a lot about internationalism, but he remains the same." End quote. Sometime later, Petrovsky reminded Shums'kyi of this conversation, warning him, and I quote, "Always keep in mind that the party will never forgive you for your little Russians. You will pay for this. Mark my word, you will pay." End quote. And Shums'kyi paid for this remark numerous times over. The absurd array of criminal charges laid against him, counter-revolutionary activities, national bias, espionage, efforts to secede Ukraine from the Soviet Union to Poland, and so on, were only different expressions of the original sin of this original remark. Shums'kyi's Maloros thesis was ahistorical, a glib simplification, a reduction of complex centuries of Russian-Ukrainian interaction into a sense of colonial self-subjugation. Indeed, it was downright offensive to millions of people. But it was supposed to be. It was supposed to shock, and by doing so, reveal the terror at the root of the seemingly benign idea of Malorossia. And in this sense, it was important then, as it is now, when this idea has been used to justify the invasion of Ukraine. Shums'kyi's thesis at the time in the 1920s, in a broader context of contestations between Stalin and Lenin over nationalities policy and then Lenin's death, threatened to expose the illegitimacy of Soviet rule in Ukraine, the hypocrisy of Ukrainization, and the broader Soviet nationality project. Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, and all the other leaders involved in Shums'kyi's assassination in 1946 never accepted the veracity of this thesis. Indeed, their construction of Shums'kyism as a nationalist diversion helped them emasculate Ukrainization and purge its adherents. So veracity was never the point. What really stung the leadership was that Shums'kyi persisted with this dangerous thesis long after it had been destroyed in Ukraine in the terror, and long after his arrest, conviction, and torture, and the execution of his wife. Indeed, deploying these measures against opponents usually silenced them if they stayed alive, but not Shums'kyi. Shums'kyi expressed this thesis directly to Stalin in the suicide letter I read at the beginning. No one spoke to Stalin like this and lived. And Shums'kyi, who survived his suicide attempts, would soon be killed. And this brings me to the value of this thesis, not only for understanding Ukrainian and Russian history, but also for the value of defiance in understanding the present. What really stung Stalin and his associates as they read aloud the suicide letter in his office was this defiance, the refusal to accept one's place in the historical hierarchy. They asked contemptuously, as they decided to assassinate him, how dare Shums'kyi speak to us like that? Amid Ukraine's continued defiance of Russia's invasion, its path to independence away from Russian influence, before and during this war, you can imagine Putin and his cronies asking, how dare the Ukrainians behave in this way? How dare Shums'kyi behave this way under interrogation? I'd like to shift now to the second strand between past and present, and that is understanding Shums'kyi's experience in what Solzhenitsyn would have called, the sewer of the Soviet system, from arrest to interrogation to his death, to understand how what made his unique experience somehow reflective of broader insights into the broader Soviet system. Now, he was unique not only by refusing to cooperate, a lot of people did this. If they weren't big political figures or just ordinary people, it didn't really matter that much. Some would commit suicide before arrest. But what really made him unique was that he launched a significant protest campaign for the duration of his arrest and detainment, not only after he confessed, like so many others did, seeking clemency, claiming that they'd been beaten up and forced to confess and so forth. That hardly worked. In fact, unlike anyone else really, he invited the police to interrogate him. Indeed, he demanded further interrogations as an opportunity to demonstrate the absurdity of his persecution, and perhaps more specifically, his keen sense that in doing so, that he could embarrass the police at the time of the winding down of the terror in 1938. This is especially important because it's quite clear that Shums'kyi was paralyzed by his experiences of violent interrogation and detainment. At this critical time in late 1938, when the Great Terror was winding down and local NKVD agencies, that is the secret police, on the peripheries were unsure of what was happening in the center in Moscow, many were generally fearful of pursuing controversial cases on orders from current bosses, fearing that they might be held responsible for mistakes by the new bosses who replaced them. Shums'kyi, despite his paralysis and clearly the deterioration of his mental health, sensed this very acutely. We can see it in the correspondence between Chekists in Krasnoyarsk, that is secret police agents, where he was being detained, and their superiors in Moscow. We're extremely lucky to have in the Ukrainian security archives an entire collection of secret police documents related to this one political figure, from his arrest, from his detainment, from the surveillance of him for more than a decade, in fact, for almost 2 decades. These were transferred to Ukraine from Krasnoyarsk in the 1950s after Stalin's death. It's very rare that we have such access to this over a long period of a person who experienced the gamut of the Soviet penal system through the terrors and afterwards. And so it's from this base that we're able to provide in the book so many of these key documents that have not been published before in English for people to get a better understanding of just how this system operated. The Krasnoyarsk chief wrote to his boss in Moscow in late 1938, I quote, "A long time has elapsed since October 1938, and we have yet to receive any information on you from this matter, on Shums'kyi. He is ill and has been detained in the prison hospital since the beginning of his arrest. Taking into account that the period of his detainment elapsed long ago and the lack of any evidence against him, we have not taken any investigatory measures in this case. We ask that you inform us immediately on measures to be taken in relation to Shums'kyi," end quote. The Krasnoyarsk NKVD was not formally required to do anything to help fulfill the orders from Moscow, especially in late 1938, to complete the prosecution of Shums'kyi toward his execution, apart from sending Shums'kyi to Moscow. But Shums'kyi's case could also be heard in his absence. Krasnoyarsk NKVD, however, had already reported that Shums'kyi was unable to be transported to Moscow for trial and reported this to Beria, specifically, who authored the original order against Shums'kyi, the incoming chief of the secret police. By refusing to at least try to provide the key evidence to advance Shums'kyi's case, his confession under interrogation, while continuing to seek instruction from Moscow on how to move forward, local NKVD performed a subtle doublespeak that successfully stalled the case. This doublespeak was perhaps the best approach to dealing with pressure to pursue a weak case against a big fish like Shums'kyi in this chaotic period from October to December 1938, when the entire secret police was undergoing massive changes and the Great Terror was subsiding. In fact, in one of his slowdown orders in November 1938, Stalin chastised NKVD agents for fabricating cases and extracting false confessions from suspects to prove them. At least on paper, he was discouraging what the Moscow NKVD was asking the Krasnoyarsk NKVD to do to Shums'kyi. Stalin will backtrack on this message, which was never sincere in the first place. At the beginning of 1939, the confession would remain the key evidence in Soviet jurisprudence. This inaction and doublespeak did not save the skin of the local NKVD leaders who were purged at the end of the terror. In fact, of the 6 NKVD leaders in Krasnoyarsk from 1935 to 1939, 4 of them would be shot. Shums'kyi had something to do with this. He sent numerous letters to Moscow protesting his detainment, though it seems a July 1939 letter addressed to Beria and other Soviet leaders attracted the most attention. We know this because the leaders sent the letter to others and discussed it. In fact, because of the luck that we have of access to Shums'kyi's files, his documents, what we have is an interplay between the most powerful leaders in the country and a paralyzed criminal in a hospital bed in Siberia. It's a fascinating interplay that plays out throughout the book. Someone who they felt was a clear and present danger to Soviet security. In it, Shums'kyi complained that the Krasnoyarsk NKVD had held him without charge or questioning for 2 years, which was clearly in contravention of the law. The failure to charge and question Shums'kyi was less problematic for its illegality than it was for the way it contradicted the purpose of his arrest, which was to kill him. Shums'kyi exacerbated this contradiction by refuting the claims made by the Krasnoyarsk NKVD to Moscow that he was too ill to be questioned, arguing that, although he was paralyzed, he could still write and speak. Indeed, he welcomed questioning as an opportunity to demonstrate his innocence, the fear of which Shums'kyi claimed was the key reason why the local NKVD had stalled his case in the first place. He wrote, and I quote, "My illness does not preclude me from being questioned. I've informed them of this orally and by letter, as although I cannot walk, I can speak and even write. The real reasons why the agencies will not undertake any investigation are quite clear. It is because they cannot charge someone with a crime they did not commit and keep them in prison at the same time." End quote. Well, they could. And pointing out such illogical problems was hardly enough to save your skin, usually. The whole terror was illogical in this sense. But Shums'kyi found that pressure point in the system and kept on pressing on it. No one else really did. So without an examination of his case, we've been fundamentally unaware of this type of capacity for survival in the Soviet penal system. Now, this has important implications for understanding the relationship between center and periphery in the purges. There have been significant debates about this, particularly from the 1990s, on the relationship between these bodies in understanding how the terror operated and especially how it ended. But I'm especially interested in what this pressure point in the system tells us about the broader machinery of Soviet repression, how bureaucratic inconsistencies were able to stall the operation of a machine in the process of killing millions of its own citizens, especially as it relates to proponents of Ukrainization who were killed in their thousands for pursuing a policy of Ukrainian sovereignty, albeit within a Soviet structure. In some ways, I think this book opens this opportunity, and I hope my colleagues will pursue a further examination. That's very much what I think about the book means for our field. As I end, I'd like to think about what this analysis might mean for Ukraine today, particularly as thousands of its citizens are subject to the types of arbitrary arrest, violent interrogation, and broader political repression wrought on them by Russian occupation forces, particularly the security forces. I've spent the past few years gathering testimonies of people's experiences of Russian occupation from 2014 onward, especially from 2022 in eastern Ukraine. This is part of a broader project I run to bring Ukraine's experiences of military occupation from 1914 to the present within a single analytical frame. I've been especially interested in the experiences of former local officials, civil administrators and others who found themselves in a very difficult position of trying to sustain the daily operations of the administrations in the first months under foreign occupation, avoiding entanglements with occupation forces that made their job so much harder and unsafe before most would escape to Ukraine. Yesterday, I had a very different conversation with a young person who had been arrested in Luhansk in 2016 as a teenager on the erroneous charge of conducting terrorist activity for the Ukrainian military. He was detained for 2 years and sentenced to a long prison term, but luckily released in a prisoner swap. He told me about his experiences under interrogation, and I told him about the general experiences of people arrested in the Soviet period, particularly during the purges. And of course, we were struck by the incredible similarities between them across these different historical contexts. Most of these similarities included, as you could imagine, arbitrary arrest, the violent interrogation aimed at forcing detainees to sign pre-written confessions of criminal activity, and threats against the person and also their loved ones if they refused. In fact, many of the people I'd spoken to over the past few years had similar experiences, especially in their detainment in basements for extended periods and a range of other inhumane practices. What is striking is not only the similarities in these practices. One might argue that occupations and policing have common characteristics, no matter who the occupiers are, but more in the methods of their delivery. The ways in which police interrogate asthmatics by blowing cigarette smoke in their face in a small closed room, or the way they let their legs dangle closely next to a woman they're interrogating with the intimation of sexual violence. And the similarities between these and the types of practices recorded in the 40s by Shums'kyi, by many and others, particularly striking in their cultural similarities. There are many differences too to talk about, but I wonder what this might mean for our understanding of the present war. If in the first part of the talk we considered the problem of Shums'kyi and Malarasia as a conduit for analysis, starting with the 20s and 1920s and ending with the 2020s, it leads us to help understand the specific strains of Russian pathologies toward Ukrainian independence, which often turn violent. But what does a similarity of violence and repression mean, if anything, across this same historical expanse? It's an open question that is sparked by the book, which I'm continuing to think about, and I'd be interested, of course, in people's thoughts on this as well. But that's all I have to say, and I'd be happy to have a discussion and answer questions.
Thank you very much, dear Philip. And it's my pleasure to invite Michelle Viise to deliver some comments on this book as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Philip, and thank you, Oleh. I think I just want to probably raise some issues that Philip has brought up. One of the mysteries of this book is how Shums'kyi survived for so long. He was targeted by this enormous repressive state, which killed millions. Why, why was it so? What was the difficulty in executing him? And I think this raises the question: what does a repressive state need of its enemies? Because that's it needed something from him, and he would not give it to them. And he was a unique person. Probably, I would propose in maybe 2 or 3 ways. One is he was completely sincere, and there's a question of dignity or honor upon which he was unshakable. He disdained insincerity, the flattery of Khrushchev. It's this a weaselly greasiness of the flatterers of the Soviet power that really irritated and angered him. So there's this question of like dignity and consistency and sincerity. And the other thing is that he was so sincere that he was ready to die for this idea of an equal union of Soviet socialist republics. So he actually believed he was like sometimes when you're reading your book, Philip, one gets a sense that he is the only true believer in the union of socialist republics, and that also it's like the powers of repression needed something from him. They needed a confession from him. He refused to give it. They needed some kind of they needed not only that, but they needed one of the things that under terror, it's hard for me to imagine someone not or myself not feeling this. Maybe the inconsistencies and the hesitations under interrogation that in which one would create that little bit of air for an accusation to be fit into, but he doesn't seem to have had it. He was like an incredibly brave person, but I think his bravery does come out of his consistency, that he really, really sincerely believed in the project, in the Soviet Union. And this is what is so strange about him. He winds up being sort of he's a communist version of a saint. Not that they would have called him a saint, but he, because of his sincerity, because of his unshakable belief, to his death, and his repeated his consistent readiness to commit to die rather than to give on this point at all. Like he would not. To me, he still is rather a mysterious person for this. Something very special about him. As you say, such such sincerity and belief wouldn't have saved someone, who wasn't one of Stalin's oldest colleagues. So we can't probably create any sort of universals about the power of sincerity to overcome a repressive state or something like that. But in his case, there were so many like him, who also believed, but who nevertheless, under the pressure, under the terror of interrogation, of imprisonment, I think there was something about the way that they acted that, if they could be crushed psychologically, then they could be killed. But he was crushed physically, and that was not enough. Stalin would not agree to kill someone who was, the fact that he was in a hospital, that he was incapacitated, seems to have held back on the ability of his being executed. The state needed something from him, and I think this is just so fascinating, and that makes him a really unusual. I think there's a lot to be mined from his case about the nature of the repressive state, about the nature of this, of a kind of an imperial project, um, and about the nature of sincerity. And I think that sincerity and true belief brings me back to this idea of his being a kind of saint. He has this, yeah. Anyway,
I think you raised two really interesting points. The first one is that there's a uniqueness, but it's valuable to contrast Shums'kyi's experiences with the thousands of others who were also arrested around the same time for the same thing. In fact, many of those would be forced to identify Shums'kyi as their ringleader for counter-revolutionary behavior. There's an excellent passage in the book where Shums'kyi confronts one of those former comrades who informed on him under interrogation falsely. And he writes this letter to Stalin, giving this example. And he says that, this person came to him in tears and apologized for his behavior. And he said, I had to confess because the party needed it. And what he meant to say by that is that for a lot of people, they were convinced, whether they believed it or not, that the confession was part of a broader cleansing of the party, of which they needed to provide for its purposes. So this was a sense of obligation. But Shums'kyi's response to this type of pressure was that, no, the party doesn't need my false confession. It needs my fight to return it back to its proper path. And very few people sustained that under the type of interrogative pressures that they faced. Confession, he understood from his earlier experiences of the Ukrainian Politburo when he was shifted out under Kaganovich in the 1920s, that if you confess and provide, all that does is hurry on your demise. It doesn't save you. And I think that was the key knowledge that he took into this, that he could only survive in as much as he could continue his protest to clear his name if he refused to provide that strange piece of legitimacy, however perverse, that in large cases, the Soviet state required to progress him to an execution. And I think it's fascinating that someone who was such a sort of single-minded adherent, principally, of this type of socialism, so was so blind in one sense, but was so incredibly acute politically in the other. And that duality of his personality certainly comes out in the book. A saint perhaps politically, but as we say, we have to be careful to understand these people in their contexts, and they are political actors. So when he joins the Bolsheviks in the early 1920s, he does so fundamentally, you could argue, by sacrificing sections of his own party, the Borodkists, that were the chief party in Ukraine at the time. He did so because of this belief, but also understanding that this could be deadly. for the people left behind. Yeah.
Thank you, dear Philip. Michelle, would you like to respond briefly, or should we move forward?
Um, I I I think if anything, I would add that that um, that what is interesting is how like the local police were stymied by him as well. So it wasn't
Yeah.
just that in the upper circles of the Politburo. That's something that filtered down throughout the whole apparatus, was that we need people to be acting a certain way. We need the objects of pressure to be acting in a certain way. And I think I mean I love this contrast you bring up of being a true believer, being true to the of being consistent in ideologically, and 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 being a believer in the state. So that kind of like the people who said no, even sincerely, might even take them sincerely, that they thought, well, I need to cave. I need to do
Yeah.
what the state needs to keep the state from being extinguished.
Yeah.
So there is a sort of a possibility of true belief in that as well, that of sincerity in that. But it's there are two different ways one can be, um, that one can be true to the state, or one could be true in this particular situation, sincere. One is ideologically, the other is to be a true supporter of the state. Um, so but I think it's just a fascinating book. We really see these strange, um, um, these strange questions arise about the nature of the repressive state, and how strangely difficult it is in this case for them
Yeah.
to handle this
Yeah.
person.
And you remember too that Shums'kyi conducted hunger strikes in protest while he was in exile, sometimes for 30, 40, even 50 days. And letting him die in this type of protest wasn't an option. In fact, the head of a special section of the NKVD writes to the Krasnoyarsk head that if Shums'kyi dies while conducting a protest against his detainment by hunger strike, you will be held personally responsible for that. So they have to sort of save him by force feeding him so they can interrogate him to get the confession to make him die properly. And you think to yourself, why are they going to such trouble? What? And there's a much broader issue for those people interested in state repression. You could go to to earlier periods in European history to understand this, the Inquisition and things like that, where there are similar things operating. But in the Soviet case, it wasn't just that he was, a big political fish. He offered a fundamentally different understanding, a critique of where Soviet nationalist policy had come to by the late 1920s and early 1930s. And it stung, and I keep on using this word because it reiterated Lenin's own criticism of Stalin as Commissar for Nationalities in the famous Georgian affairs in the early 1920s that undermined the type of empire he was building. And I think it gnawed very much at the leadership. He was a thorn in that side. And you think, well, he's a paralyzed criminal in the Far East. What do they care? But they spoke about him. And in 1946, when they decided to assassinate him, they didn't just concoct this idea that he was a Ukrainian nationalist going to fight in the insurgency against Soviet power. They were clearly evidencing this belief. So for me, it's fascinating how, this person ridden in a hospital bed in terrible conditions, unable to move, is considered a clear and present danger to Soviet security. You know, what does that tell us about this place? Lording over 170 million souls and worrying about this paralyzed person in Siberia. It's, you know,
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Philip. So I would like to proceed with our conversation, and clearly this is raising questions that are far deeper than just the figure of Oleksandr Shums'kyi himself. I'm personally, I'm struck by the similarities that Philip already emphasized to the present situation. As some of our viewers might know, we had published a kind of an autobiographical nonfiction work by Stanislav Aseyev, a journalist and a writer from Donetsk who was held illegally in prison for almost 3 years. And he described very similar torture techniques and kind of the need for the oppressive regime of the Russian Federation to extract a false confession from the individual that they had arrested illegally and held in prison while torturing, and so on, kind of, and the same techniques of humiliation and trying to break the person. And luckily for Stanislav Aseyev, he was released in a prisoner swap. And the book ends on a positive note, namely stressing how important it is to survive as a human being, to not be broken mentally, right? You can be broken physically, just like Oleksandr Shums'kyi was, but to not be broken psychologically is much more important for your survival as a human being, kind of maintaining your integrity. And so I want to direct the attention of our viewers today, wherever they're watching us, to the page of this book by Filip Slaveski and Yuri Shapoval on our website. It's books.hury.edu, and you can find the book there in various formats. You can rent it online, you can get a print edition or an ebook edition. And if you haven't read the book yet, I strongly invite you to read this book and discover more about it as you read it. Again, we dearly miss Yuri Shapoval with us, but nevertheless, we're grateful that Filip Slaveski is able to join us despite the super early hour over in Australia. So the first question that I want to ask basically has to do with the origins of Oleksandr Shums'kyi. This is something that you discuss in the first chapter, where you open up some questions of his biography and of his early political life, things that you have already alluded today. I wonder if you could kind of go a little bit more over the early kind of parts of his biography. Not just obviously his personal life early on, but also how he got involved with the Borotbaists and how he gave up that party under the pressure from the Bolsheviks, kind of effectively sacrificing people in the process.
Like a lot of Communist Party members, he had to lie about his social origins to appear as he came from a workers' family. In fact, he didn't so much. He came from a long line of priests. Uh, his mother was German, and his father was probably the third or fourth generation. His grandfather, sorry, was third or fourth generation priest. So there's also a degree of Polish origin as well. So Zhytomyr is his hometown. There's a plaque, I think, and a street named after him still there. There's not much. Uh, his origins and his, I think, entrance into the socialist revolutionary movement were quite common for the time. Uh, he fled to the cities away from sort of the provinces, seeking sort of a new life. It was really his sort of initial exposure to factory work and then the front, where he was sent because of as punishment for his revolutionary activity, that really radicalized him. Uh, you know, he was far more radical on the land question. He was a land surveyor. His father had been a sort of a worker on a large estate by a noble. And so he was very radical about the equal distribution of land to the peasantry. So you can see why he sort of went over to the socialist revolutionaries initially. Uh, the war and then the revolution, I think, hardened his opinion on the national question as well. Not something he applied too much attention to early, but by 1917 to by 1918, in addition to being radical on land question, became far more radical on the question of Ukrainian independence. The current governments that claim to rule Ukraine in this very chaotic period after the collapse of the provisional government and then the Bolsheviks taking power, none of them, in his opinion, represented Ukraine in the way in which he understood it. And what really drove him there was a representative government. How do we create a representative government that is revolutionary, socialist, but at the same time is uh, is a vehicle towards national liberation? And this was a very difficult question because they're fighting a civil war against nationalist forces across the former disintegrating Russian Empire. So how do you disentangle socialism from nationalism, or nationalism from sort of the rightist forces that are claiming it? These were big questions for the whole revolutionary movement to tangle. And one of the sort of chief importances of Shums'kyi is his theoretical work in the early 20s trying to do so. What is it about his upbringing, I think, that's most unique, perhaps, in this period? Uh, well, he, like a lot of people, he had a wife and 3 children. We have no understanding of what happened to them. My sense is that most of them died in the Russian Civil War and the famine. One child, I think, survived. He then remarried in the late 1920s within Marxist circle, Yevdokia Honcharenko, who was shot in 1938. I should say something about her too. She too refused to implicate Shums'kyi under interrogation for false crimes. They tried to do that to her and they shot her instead, even though that was quite clear. He had no idea of what occurred to her until just before his death. His son, one of his sons, at least that we know of, died in the Battle for Moscow in 1942. So by the time he commenced his sort of suicide attempts, we read his diaries in 1943 and 1944, and there's no one left. He has no family left. And although he's released from prison back into exile as a paralytic, there's no life for him as such. And I think it's at that point that he decides to stop seeking political rehabilitation. He decides to stop asking the party to right its wrong and to basically rehabilitate him as a political figure, which he held so dearly. And he gives up in that sense. And when he gives up in that sense, all that's left, he goes beyond the pale of what's acceptable for protest within the Soviet movement, and he becomes a real enemy after that. And it's at that point that he understands he becomes specifically liable to assassination. And his suicide attempts and his letters to Stalin, I think, in some ways are an invitation to be killed.
Thank you, dear Philip. I think this kind of goes more in this direction that Michelle had pointed out, that structurally there is this readiness to sacrifice his life for something he believed in, somehow strangely reminds us of the lives of saints as we know them from early Christianity, right? Kind of the same radical idea that the life is not something that one should treasure if one has to give up one's integrity, right? So I think it's a fascinating story. But let's kind of go back a little bit to so you've already pointed out some of the origins that I think are very important to understand the type of communism, the type of
Yeah,
socialism that Shums'kyi believed in, and obviously that does not remove the particularities of the Soviet system that perhaps claimed to represent similar values and beliefs, but in reality, perhaps was not,
yeah,
as open to realizing that. But can we talk more about how he rose to power within the Soviet system then? Because
yeah.
he became a very powerful commissar or the
Indeed,
People's Commissar. If you
indeed.
could talk about this a little bit.
Um, One of the biggest problems facing Ukraine in the revolution 1917-18 was that I think local movements lacked, I think, power and popular representation on their own to form the type of Ukrainian state they wanted. The Bolsheviks from the outside lacked the people on the ground in order to enforce the type of rule that they wanted. So the Ukrainian Social Republic that emerges in the 1920s is almost a balance between these forces. And Shums'kyi in this plays a pivotal role in this establishment. How does he do so? Well, I think it's the second chapter of the book that talks about how the intra-party politics plays out, the negotiations with the Bolsheviks. Um, in sort of the Bolsheviks were the largest party in Ukraine at the time, but parties did not represent much of the population. They weren't well known. They were sort of engaging in political activity on a small scale. But most of the party leadership was under 30. They were young, idealistic, in some ways, at certain times, naive. And I think one of the major problems that they faced was that they came to believe the assurances provided by Lenin that their union with the Bolsheviks, as much as they resisted, would allow them to use the power of the party to achieve their both socialist and their socialist ideals, but also the national liberationist ideals for Ukraine. Very quickly thereafter, Lenin goes back on that and uses the party machinery to grind out the Bolshevist members and to remove them as a separate political force. So they're undone in this very early. Now, was Shums'kyi aware of this? I don't know, but there's significant claims that in exchange for his advocacy for joining the Ukrainian parts or the Bolshevist party with the Bolshevik party, that he would be provided, along with others, a significant position within the new party structure. And I think that was his bargain, that he was willing to accept the fact that his party coming in would be diminished, but by assuming this very powerful structure that was the Commissar for Education, that he would be able to use the power of the state to pursue his goals of national self-liberation. And he does. And in fact, it's his pursuit of those goals in advocating for Ukrainian language use, culture, and literature across society that eventually he does it so what was considered to be radically by the late 1920s that results in his removal. So I think that is the bargain that he makes. And he believes that the initial commitment of the revolutionary state to these nationalist ideals, which really it had made in order to sort of re-entangle the spider webs of the disintegrating Russian Empire to support the Bolsheviks in fighting the Civil War, but with the Civil War over, had far less impetus to sustain them. There's an excellent letter written by Stalin to Lenin, published only, I think, in the late 90s, where Stalin reminds Lenin that we have to be careful because some of these what you call them nationals in the peripheries, like Shums'kyi, are taking the ideas about national self-liberation literally, that they don't understand what the national liberation as a game that we're playing, rather than pursuing it wholeheartedly. And he said, unless we bring these people into line, now they're complaining, who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So we know where Stalin is on this. But remember, this is 1922 when he's still in contest in some ways with Lenin over the direction of nationalities policy and so forth. But it's ambiguous. Remember, they need to sustain, or Korenizatsiya, it roots Bolshevik influence in areas where they didn't have it across the vast expanse in all different cultures and areas of the Soviet Union as it goes. But at the same time, they're very mindful that unless there are significant boundaries that are put in to stop people from thinking that they can just go beyond the control of Moscow in seeking their self-liberation, they might have trouble. And what Kaganovich and Stalin do so expertly in the late 1920s is that they change the parameters, they change those boundaries and push their enemies across them. And they do this to Shums'kyi and they do it to others as well, and not only in Ukraine, but in other places. So he was already made a political sort of non-persona in the late 1920s, and they gathered Stalin's relationship with the secret police already in this period was gathering material on these people for years, so that when in 1933, when we have a massive crash, particularly in the famine in Ukraine and massive resistance to collectivization, they have an argument, or they start to argue, that it's these nationals on the side that are spurring on this resistance, and there's already an infrastructure in place to remove them. So this is a long time coming.
Thank you, dear Philip. You already kind of went into the next question that I wanted to ask, so it's a perfect segue, I think, in talking about the fall, right? So we talk about the rise and kind of what it took for Shums'kyi to rise to this very powerful commissar position. And I would just want to note that, as we can see from very early on, the ideological aspect, the propaganda aspect was very important to the Soviet Union, hence the attention they paid to education as well as to culture, right? And so kind of being on top of a structure such as that obviously was very important to Shums'kyi, but it was, broadly speaking, a very influential position within the kind of the configuration of the Soviet Union as it had emerged. In terms of his fall, you already kind of started pointing
Yeah.
to some of the issues, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that kind of the clash that
Yeah.
kind of set all of that in motion between Shums'kyi and Lazar Kaganovich, in which basically kind of the aftermath of that was not just the purge of Shums'kyi, but the purge of the entire
Yeah.
kind of pro-Ukrainian communist elite in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic.
Yeah. Stalin sent Kaganovich to Ukraine in 1926 to sort of establish control over the Politburo as part of his broader contestation for the leadership in Moscow. There were people in the Ukrainian Politburo that were close to Stalin's opponents. Kaganovich was supposed to sniff them out. It wasn't determined exactly what to do with Shums'kyi at the beginning, but it was clear that his commitment to the, I guess, and I use this term loosely, a liberal atmosphere in promoting Ukrainian culture was going beyond the boundaries of Ukrainization. So one of Shums'kyi's roles was to support Ukrainian artists, poets, writers, to publish and to sort of help mold society. And he would do this. Uh, he understood his role as promoting it, not censoring what they wrote. And so when the great futurist poets, Khvilivi and others, started to write about the necessity of Ukraine sort of standing up on its own two feet and following, cultural influences outside of Russia, particularly in Europe, okay, this caused a massive stir. And what you'll see is that the Bolsheviks started to reiterate some of the older tropes of Russian attitudes toward Ukrainian cultural independence, that these sorts of things were creating a conflagration between Ukrainian and Russian workers. That they were sowing the seeds of antagonism and antipathy among Ukrainians toward Russians. So the strive toward independence and emerging from the Russian influence was always understood in this particular way. That the terminology changed to reflect socialist considerations in the 20s, but this was a long time coming. Shums'kyi was ideologically committed to supporting these people, and he refused to back down when he was pushed by Stalin and Kaganovich to make public pronouncements denouncing them. This was the core of the problem. So this was the core of the problem, sorry, was that he was committed to this ideal, and they found these examples in order to remove him from his position. Okay, so that's fundamentally how they identified him. And what happens from 1927 when he's removed to 1933 is that his initial problems, his support for these people comes from it turns from a accusation of just being insufficiently vigilant against bourgeois influence, to then supporting counter-revolutionary activity, to then supporting national diversion, to then terrorist activity, and it just escalates as it does with other people by the time we get to 33 with his arrest. And so they deal with him very expertly, and they do this to others as well. And I think what Shums'kyi knows what's going on, but he refuses to play the game. And I think that's what does him in. And I wonder sometimes, when they're dealing with his protest leaders throughout the 1930s and they decide to kill him, I don't think they ever expected him to make a confession, because they'd known his character earlier, but they pressed on nonetheless. And I think there was no place in the Ukrainian Politburo for such people, or the Soviet or Union Politburo either, for such people as this, who were committed ideologically to those positions and who would not use policy in such a way as to position themselves advantageously against their opponents, like Stalin and the others were so expertly doing in Moscow at the time. I think by the end of the 20s, his type of party member was becoming far, far and less He referred to himself as a lishny человек, so that means someone in excess, no longer needed. And I think that's certainly what he had in mind when he was speaking about himself in the late 1920s.
Thank you, Philip. So this is, I think it's fascinating to kind of to see at this internal dynamics, which he must have understood pretty well, and then nevertheless refused to play the game, right? Kind of, he
Yeah.
is obviously seems to be someone who was not very naive, even while holding his beliefs, but kind of it appears that what really was important to him is not to give up on what he believed in, simply because the system no longer or maybe never actually was interested in realizing them. Um, in talking about Shums'kyi, and kind of you proceed with that in chapter 5 of the book, you emphasize specifically the nature of his campaign for himself, as an interplay, as a kind of as a pretty active lobbying on his own behalf with the party leadership. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, perhaps from the point of view of access as well, the fact that a prisoner's letters would be read by the head of the state, right? It's kind of hard to imagine from today's perspective. So I think it speaks to the importance of the figure, but also to the uniqueness of what he was accomplishing.
Uh, there's a fascinating exchange that's contained in the archives between the head of a special section of the NKVD in Moscow, dealing with counter-revolutionary crimes, and the local head of the Krasnoyarsk NKVD. They are telegraph sort of strips that are pasted on to a cardboard piece. And the local member says to his boss in Moscow, I don't know what to do. This guy won't eat for 50 days. He claims he won't do anything until he's sent to Moscow to be seen by the Central Committee. Should I send him? And the response is, don't do anything. Don't send him anywhere. Take him and force feed him. And don't promise him anything. And these are the types of sort of panicked exchanges you see between serious people at the top and locals about what to do with him. So he did send numerous protests, and they were read by senior political figures. We know that because then they passed them on to others and they discussed them. The Central Committee at different times in Moscow had read his reports as well. Uh, he was he was lucky in the sense that his protests sometimes were sufficient enough to stay his execution. In 1933, when he was sentenced to a significant prison term, it was commuted by an appeal on the basis that, and you'll hear this term used consistently throughout the book, the lack of any real evidence against him. And that meant there was no confession. Then in 1937, when the purge restarts and he's rearrested in exile in the Far East, we get the same problem. They go through the motions of interrogation and so forth, nothing's given, and then they write back to Moscow and they say, there's no real evidence against him. There's no confession. What do we do? And no one really knows. And I think by presenting himself in such a way through his consistent refusing to give a confession, but also writing and outlining what the police were doing wrong. Now, that doesn't matter during a type of, violent purge and terror. That's normal. But at a time when those things are coming down and the state, particularly Stalin, who's sort of ordered these things to happen in the first place, but then is scapegoating the police and instituting a range of public measures to reduce their jurisdictional powers in relation to the other legal agencies and so forth, then when you outline that the police have been undertaking these types of illegal measures in your case, that's embarrassing. This happened in 1934 with Yagoda. That's one of the reasons why he was commuted. It happens in 1938, which is one of the reasons why he stayed. Shums'kyi knows how the system works. He built it or helped to build it in Ukraine. So he knows when and how to act in such a way through his protests. And he knows that they don't want to let him die in protest. So he has three major, what do you call them, hunger strikes. Now, hunger strikes, for those of you who know anything about sort of political prisoners in both Tsarist times and in Soviet times, was a common form of protest until the mid-1930s, when the Soviets started shooting uh, people undertaking uh, hunger strikes on the basis that the hunger strike itself was counter-revolutionary. They didn't do this with Shums'kyi, and so his health deteriorated greatly, but they couldn't deal with it, and so I think by continuing to behave in this way, he poses a problem to the normal functioning of the machinery. Uh, they were fearful that he might be a martyr to the movement. And so him dying in these types of circumstances before he confessed his crimes might be a problem. And that was certainly the major issue. I mean, Abakumov, who takes over the MGB in 1946, he takes on Shums'kyi's case, and he in a sense doctors documents and evidence in such a way as to present to Stalin as to say that Shums'kyi, who is a paralyzed person in exile, is trying to make his way back to Ukraine so that he can join OUN UPA in Western Ukraine to fight against the Soviet Union. Well, this is madness. He's a committed communist who despises the right and vice versa. But that doesn't really matter, because it's not so much the charge itself as the intent behind it that tells us something. It tells us that at this point, when the insurgency is raging in Western Ukraine in the onset of the Cold War, then Shums'kyi, who's been charged with assisting foreign powers in ceding Ukraine from the Soviet Union, engaging in foreign liaisons, which are dangerous and so forth, suddenly people like him become active again. And so it's not just Shums'kyi at this time, but it's a range of others that are removed or liquidated at a time when they become dangerous as the context changes. And so his assassination, funnily enough, we know about his assassination for a couple of things. A lot of people thought that he died in 1933 until this point, or that he died in the camps. He was at Solovetsky Islands in the late 1930s. But in fact, it was Russian historians in the 90s that published in newspapers evidence of this. Pavel Sultoplatov, the famous assassin under Stalin, who wrote his memoirs and mentioned Shums'kyi. But Yuri, who's not here, was in Luhansk in 1994 working in the FSB archive. And he located the operational document for his for Shums'kyi's assassination. This is the document that Abakumov had taken to Stalin to seek his approval for the assassination in August 1946, when those discussions took place that I referred to in the talk. How dare Shums'kyi speak to us like this? He's insolent. That's the word that they used. How dare he criticize nationalities policy? Who does he think he is? So you're right. He understood how to work at those particular times, but he was also very lucky. He could have died at any moment given his health. Someone could have shot him and dealt with the consequences perhaps, but he was smart but lucky at the same time.
Thank you, dear Philip. So you kind of already also went into the kind of what forced perhaps the hand of the regime in some way. In fact, it kind of the reality that Shums'kyi survived because he stayed within the system for such a long time, right? The judicial system that obviously was deeply corrupt, but nevertheless tried to maintain an appearance of being lawful and legal in kind of in the ways that we conceive of them today. And what seems to force kind of then this case outside of the legal system and into the kind of the shadow of
Yeah,
intelligence work and assassination was precisely that. So
yeah,
maybe you could talk a little bit more about that as well as about
yeah,
the context of 1946, right? You already mentioned
yeah,
briefly that there was resistance going on in Ukraine, and following the situation, that certain figures were activated, and the doctored evidence, right? The evidence as such did not exist, so they could not prosecute him within the legal
yeah.
system.
Uh, in many ways, the letter that I read out at the beginning of the talk, his October 1946 suicide note to Stalin, was a confession. A confession in the sense that he no longer wanted absolution from the state. He was no longer, in a sense, within the context of a committed communist who was seeking redemption. And I think that was clear in the letter, and it was Abakumov who used it as evidence to say that, look, this is a confession from someone who's not, one of us and never was really, but clearly who's gone over to the other side. So he's clearly just criticizing without asking for anything in return. Shums'kyi had been writing to Stalin for 20 years. They'd met numerous times in the 1920s. They spoke on the phone, and he'd always been asking for the same things. He'd been asking for a review of his case, for his intervention, although he knew that he was responsible for it, for assistance when his family was impoverished, and a range of other things. October 1946 was the only time they didn't ask him for anything, but he blamed him. He blamed Stalin for the rise of the insurgent movement in Western Ukraine. He blamed him for the collapse of the nationalities policy. He blamed him for the losses in the war. This is at the height of Stalin's domestic and international prestige. As I said, no one spoke to him this way and lived. And so it was his moving beyond, I think, that even though he was protesting, it was within recognizable bounds, moving beyond that. And when he did that, he was right for someone like Abakumov to connect him to a dangerous security situation in Western Ukraine. Shums'kyi had been asking over and over again to return to Ukraine so that he could die in his homeland. They interpreted this as evidence that he wanted to return to engage in the fight against Soviet power. And how they killed him was that they allowed him to go. They gave him permission only so that they could position him on a train from Saratov to Moscow, and they could kill him on the way. And the way in which they do that, sort of the classic Soviet style, the team of assassins go in at midnight when there's an exchange between the staff and it's empty. He's alone in his carriage, or he has an assistant because he's paralyzed, he's moved out. And in the darkness, they go in, they cover his mouth so he can't scream, and they prick him with a radioactive substance that has been developed by Marinovsky in his lab. So there's no medical trace of his murder. He dies from a cranial hemorrhage at some, I think it's 400 km south of Moscow at a railway station at Kirsanov. And who knows, he's probably buried in a ground there if they did, or they just burnt him and there's ashes somewhere in an unmarked grave.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking so eloquently about this and for writing this book in the first place and dedicating your time and effort to this. Before we transition to the questions from the audience, and I invite everyone to pose any questions that you might have. But before we go to that, I would like to invite Michelle Viise for one last concluding comment, very briefly, and then we'll continue on.
Well, if you need any words from me to buy this book, then you haven't been listening. It's been wonderful, interesting for so many reasons, including the fact that it's another window, another piece of the puzzle um, uh, regarding the security apparatus, the bureaucracy, and what it's required to work, what would spike the wheels of the machinery. And of course the history of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, obviously, and lastly, probably a weird extension of the conversation about what the Soviet Union should be by insiders, long after that the state had calcified and the conversation was over. Shums'kyi still seems to be conducting that conversation and treating it as if it were alive. But I certainly invite you. It's a fascinating work, and there's so many. What's wonderful is the translation of these excerpts of letters and conversations that really give a lot of insight into the conversations amongst the people in the the apparatus of the Soviet Union, including this lovely, despairing, these desperate, panicked notes from security forces who are guarding Shums'kyi, which I also find to be just fascinating. So buy the book; it's available and well worth your time.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Michelle. And it's my pleasure to now transition to the question and answers from our audience. We have one that has been already answered, so I'll just read it. It's from Jay Wilbur, and it says, "Is it known how he was actually killed?" The answer is yes. It's in the last chapter of the book, and Philip already gave a preview. But if you're interested in kind of very detailed of an account, then please read the last chapter of the book, and you will find everything in there. Um, then. I will have two more questions. One is from Frank Sisson, who asks, please amplify how Shumsky's concept of Maloross related to the pre-revolution use and how it related to Khvylev's use. Was he influenced by Western Ukrainian usage, since Galicians played a major role in the Ukrainianization?
Yes, I think he was. He was a de facto head of the Communist Party of Western Ukraine. He wasn't listed among them, but he was a major advisor to them. He was one of their major defenders. He was a close associate, a close friend of Hillary. I think he learned a great deal about sort of cultural matters from him as well. Uh, the pre-revolutionary sense, I think Shums'kyi was a bad historian. Uh, he was a polemicist. Uh, and so I think that he wasn't interested deeply in the historical roots of this term. Uh, your own sort of people in your own institute have written long histories from the 16th and 17th centuries about where this usage comes from and the rise of Ukrainian sort of identity. I don't think Shums'kyi was interested in any of this. I think he understood the term as a polemical usage against what he considered to be a historical subjugation of Ukraine by particular types, not only of Russian intervention, but the way in which accomplices, as he would call them, assisted that. And so for him, it was a colonial self-subjugation. So the Malaros was someone who facilitated the humiliation of Ukraine from outside and gained from it. That was his understanding, rather than a deeper historical sense uh, uh, that some of the others might have shared that had a deeper knowledge of the term.
Thank you, dear. Thank you, dear Philip. And I think it also opens kind of deeper the question of how colonization works more broadly, right? Because so Shumsky in particular kind of opens up one aspect of it, but the question of self subjugation, right, is
Yeah,
something that is not very often discussed, especially in cases of colonization between cultures or groups of people that are ethnically or racially very similar, right? We have
yeah,
already an ongoing discussion and a whole field of studying racially diverse um, relationships of subjugation and colonization. But cases of subjugation and colonization of racially and ethnically similar or very close groups is less studied. All right, and we have one more question, and this one is from Hiroyaki Kuromiya, who asks, there were many deaths in post-World War II Ukraine. Do you expect that some of them will turn out to have been assassinations? In other words, the case of Shums'kyi, was it just a tip of an iceberg, or was it a rather isolated case? Do you have any sense of that?
yeah. So there are numerous uh, Ukrainians who are in the Far East in exile and the rest who are rearrested in 1946 on the suspicion that they become active again through correspondence with Western Ukrainian anti-Soviet forces that are waging an insurgency, but also the activation of foreign Ukrainian emigre societies in Germany and in the US. And so there's a rise in the rearrests. I don't think they're executed or assassinated. I think they're rearrested. And I remember reading in the party archive in Moscow the sort of the Supreme Soviet evaluation of the cases of people who had been referred for execution, referred for capital punishment. And in those cases, you've got a lot of Vlasovites, a lot of others who'd ranged. And in most cases, there can be a commutation to 25 years of hard labor if there's some circumstances. But when the charge is Ukrainian nationalism, given that the fact that there's an ongoing battle at the time, none of those are commuted. They go through. So it's certainly there is a revamp at this time, as there is in other times of Soviet history, when other contexts sort of reignite existing arrests and accusations of people who are already in the system.
Thank you, dear Philip. Um, well, we have come to an end of our event. I would like to thank Philip and also Yuri Shapoval for participating, for first of all, for writing this important book, for making this research available in English. And hopefully this will stimulate further research both in the figures such as Oleksandr Shums'kyi, but also into the broader questions of that period, of the phenomenon of the Soviet Union, the early Soviet Union, and of the relationship between the Soviet Union and the cultures and peoples that it subjugated. I invite everyone again to go ahead and purchase a copy of the book for themselves. The best way to support us as the publishers would be to buy directly from us, either in paper format, in print format, or in digital format. But if you are in Australia, obviously do buy from a local bookstore. And that also applies to people who watch us in Europe. Otherwise, please continue supporting Ukrainian studies by reading books and by doing research yourself if you are a scholar. I would like to invite everyone to the events next week. One of them is hybrid. It's called the Russo-Ukrainian War Through the Eyes of a Historian, which is a 2026 Patrician Memorial Lecture by Serhiy Plokhy, who is the professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard University. The other event also next week is virtual, April 10th. It's called Ordinary People Don't Carry Machine Guns, which is a book talk with Artem Chapai as part of the TCUP, the Tamerty Contemporary Ukraine Program Book Club Series. Please go to our website, here.harvard.edu, and sign up for our newsletter or check out the details for each event. We look forward to seeing you next time. Once again, many thanks to Filip Slaveski for his participation. Many thanks to Yuri Shapoval, who couldn't be here. And of course, to Michelle Viise for editing the book and for commenting on it today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.